So this is my final speech, and I come to you 1 year on from when I was inaugurated last year, so just 1 year older, but a lot wiser in understanding the Institute and understanding the work that the planners are doing both here in the UK and globally. And I'd like to start with just a few thank yous, actually, quite a few thank yous, to the people who provided support to me over the last 2 years. So my first is to Andrew Taylor, past chair of the board, who unfortunately had to dash off for a meeting with his company, housing company. But Andrew basically suggested I sit on the board and also gave me encouragement to run for president. I'm eternally grateful to him for that. I'd also like to thank Janet Askew. Janet, are you still here? Janet, right on the back row, and for her encouragement in 2015 as well. And whilst all sectors of Bottorff Lane have provided me with some support, the major areas really were comms and marketing. And I'd like to quickly thank Rebecca, Renee, and of course Josh for doing all the media work as well. I'd also like to thank Richard and the policy team for banging out those slides and that information which I needed to present the message on behalf of the Institute as well. I'd also like to thank Berenice for organising so efficiently these meetings. And finally on the list of thank yous, I'd just like to say thank you for Trudy, basically for being Trudy, who brought to my experience the benefit of having dealt with, I think, 6 previous presidents, so she gave wise counsel in that respect. I'd also like to thank Hilary, my wife, wonderful wife actually, for sitting through, in various guises, actually sitting through many of my speeches, which have been rehearsed and rehearsed again, and for her edits and corrections and good advice in that sense. But also my year has been dominated by 3 major events. The first one was Brexit. Of course, we had the referendum in 2016. But the outcome, how we exit the EU, will shape the UK for the next 30 or 40 years at least. It was a touchstone for all future debates on environmental and planning policy. And interestingly, my first international event was in Budapest in Hungary, where the planners there, underpinning this conference, was how planners were debating how Hungary is still trying to reconcile from moving from a state-led planned economy and country to being basically trying to take advantage of the EU and what that had to offer and all the issues that pose and challenges it pose for its environmental and planning policy. And in a way, in this country, we're at the reverse spectrum of that. And as planners, it's important that we're fully engaged in the debate on Brexit. A key issue about our policies that we have enjoy high environmental, ethical and planning standards in this country. And that's so important we protect that during the debate on Brexit, particularly because in many respects it represents the USP of the work that consultancies do in garnering external contracts within Europe and overseas. And that's so important. And that's a market which is set to grow considerably. I also enjoyed meeting representatives from the other professional bodies, and it's good that we've got the new president of the RSS here today. Secondly, housing. Now, the year, obviously, how the housing issue was thrown into sharp focus by the awful tragedy in town. But the year started with the government issuing its white paper on fixing the broken housing market, which was really a candid assessment of where we are. And I think the government deserves credit for setting out and being so honest about where we are with housing, but also it deserves credit for setting out a framework for how to try and address those issues as well. It deserves credit for setting an increase in planning fees to resolve some of the constraints which many of our local planning departments suffer from at the moment. But the real issue in housing is affordability, with house price to household income ratio extending up from 7 to 8, and in parts of the southeast 12, 14. And that's just an impossible burden for many families to actually address, unless they're in the upper quartile ranges of salaries. And this issue alone will not be solved by just increasing supply of market. given the complexities and dynamics of the housing market. And years ago, we always knew that if we entered recession, wages would go down, people would lose their jobs, house prices would go down. And there was that correlation, that simple relationship. Today, whilst we may have wages in stasis, the global financial sector has no respect for regional or local boundaries or national boundaries as well. And it promotes and it accelerates the growth in prices. And that's where we come in as a profession. And that's where we come in to address the affordability issue in the best way we can. And I commend anyone reading Janet Morfitt's report and the National Planning Forum report on housing. Thirdly, the election. Oh dear. We had strong and stable. We had coalitions of chaos. We had the squeezed middle morphed into the just about managing. And the environmentalists realised there's no such thing as a pecuniae arbor magicae. There's no magic monetary. But the result meant that with a minority government, whilst we have a government in office, we don't necessarily have a government with full levers on power. And caution and prevarication prevail. And that's critical because we need big decisions made on the big infrastructure which this country needs. And it's important that as planners, we constantly lobby to get secure the right investment in the right places on the right scale. Now, a year ago in my inaugural speech, I posed several questions, which as it turned out were rhetorical. Some of these were based on how as an international body of professionals we're addressing the global concerns of climate change, pollution and urbanisation. And we're the only professional body with a global reach to address these concerns, to set the agenda and deliver on improved outcomes for local communities. Although the government has adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and it does collect information around these, there needs to be a paradigm shift, as Dr. Geraghty, our very own Peter Geraghty, I think he's in the audience, has argued for in a recent article. And whilst many devolved nations have introduced legislation which actually respects that and tries to take the new agenda on board, the English planning system is lacking in that respect. And again, we must challenge governments to make decisions. I'll just go on to my slides now. And I think I put this slide up actually because the first event I actually attended was a parliamentary reception for planning out. And to me, it's essential that for a profession which serves a very broad spectrum, all society, which is composed of so many different elements, that we have a professional body which represents that and feels supported in that work. And also, I recognise the work that women in planning are doing as well. But Planning Out do a lot of work for lesbian, gay, transgender communities. Now, secondly, we're looking at diversity of place. I'm a firm believer that planning as an aspect of social policy should deliver on the social justice agenda. And that if we lose sight of this, then we lose our moral purpose. And I wanted on my presidential visits to visit those places where I felt this is very apparent and I'd expect to see planners working there. And I wasn't disappointed. So the next really is just a few images of where I went and who I attended with. So the first one was in Stoke-on-Trent, my visit to the West Midlands. And Stoke-on-Trent is an area which is suffering from the blight of the declining pottery industry, it's suffering from the decline of the coalfields. And Stoke-on-Trent do an enormous amount of work, cross-boundary work. And cross-boundary work and partnership work is a feature which you didn't expect to find, but it's a feature of the modern planning system, where planning departments are cutting across the administrative boundaries of local authorities and seeking to regenerate. Now, in contrast, I've got the Brecon Beacons National Park, where there you've got the national park planners are seeking to address issues of so many visitors coming into the park, additional car parking, and also plotting routes, laying out paths of natural stone up to the top of the beacons. The next one is Battersea Power Station. And if Donald is beaming in, Donald, this is a big site next to your new American embassy. And it's a pity you didn't visit because you'd have seen Battersea Power Station, where the Battersea Power Station very successful sponsors of our Parliament's reception in November, they're creating a new community. 4,000 new homes, about 2,500 new jobs, an extension to the Northern Line. It's just, you know, indicative of the scale of work that some of our professionals are involved in. In contrast, Accrington, my hometown, where a very, very small planning department are working very hard to regenerate town centre. We recently secured planning permission for a bus station, which was being built when I was there. And more importantly, they received extensive plaudits for the work on housing renewal. Plaudits to the extent that even Rowan Moore, writing the Observer, actually noticed it, which is very positive as well. And my first visit to Scotland, Dumfries and Galloway. Dumfries and Galloway, a beautiful part of the world actually. This is the River Nith, where the planners worked on a whole scheme to introduce barriers down the river, which surprisingly, despite the fact that some shopkeepers have been flooded out in the previous 2 years, attracted quite a lot of objections. But that, I suppose, highlights the sort of dichotomies that planners work in, really, on seeing that on one level, I mean, clearly a win-win, but on others, to some, it's not necessarily a win-win. As planners, we all know we find ourselves in difficult situations dealing with local communities. And also, it's an area of the world where you've got the Galloway Dark Forest, which is Galloway Forest, actually. It's an extensive area of woodland where the planning team have worked on delivering guidance to ensure that lighting can be put in a certain way, new settlements can be introduced in a certain way into the forest without adversely impacting on wildlife. Next slide, Glasgow. And these two gentlemen, Foyles Barron and Patrick McLaughlin, with Kate and from our Scottish team, they're engaged in an enormous regeneration programme across the whole of Glasgow, involving significant housing renewal. And their challenge is the fact that over the last 35 years, the population of Glasgow has gone down by about 25%, and they're increasing, it's now stabilised, and they're trying to increase it to ensure that Glasgow fulfills its historic, political and cultural role. And then in September, I visited Hull, City of Culture, and I had a great pleasure there in sharing a platform with Martin Green, who was the Director of Culture. And I had great pleasure actually speaking before Martin Green, because Martin Green is a very flamboyant, very articulate man who could just walk and strut around the stage and do all that sort of thing without any reference to his slides, actually. So you imagine if you had to follow someone like that on stage, it would be very difficult and embarrassing. But for me, the role of the planning department in this was seeing Hull as a massive venue for the whole City of Culture programme. And they worked hard to create the civic spaces, to improve the buildings and extend the public realm, improve this public realm, to ensure that within that massive venue called Hull for 1 year, there are a whole set of individual venue spaces where people can congregate, meet and share ideas and the whole event programme. That's a great, great achievement. And Alex Codd and his team deserve enormous credit for that. Then on to New York. New York, where I attended the American Planning Association conference. And I learned several things in New York as a single man. And the first one was basically that we heard a few years ago actually that Brandon Lewis, when he was Minister for Housing and Planning, was talking about, arguing in a very stentorian way, we're moving to a zoning planning system. And when you get into zoning, you understand that it's highly bureaucratic. The zoning codes for a city like New York run into vast volumes of books. You know, they're not adaptable, they're not flexible. And that's a characteristic of our planning system, which is rooted in the local democracy. I also attended a session on something called New York urbanism versus urbanism. And the conclusion of that session was that actually there are very few cities who can catch up with New York urbanism. But when you explore what new urbanism in the American context is, it's really way, way behind where our context is. We're having strong green belts and having town centres which are cohesive, has really redefined what urbanism is, and we're very lucky in that respect. Moving on to Newcastle, I visited the North East, I went to South Tyneside District Council, to South Shields, so the Word, which is a new library, which is about a cultural regeneration of the city. I also visited Gateshead as well. And it occurred to me that, you know, when we talk of Northern Powerhouse, we talk about regional cities. What we should be talking about Northern Powerhouse, we should see it as a city, as a region of cities. And that's an important deflection in seeing it as a cohesive area which is designed and can be used to rival London and the South East. And then on to Margate, Dreamland, or part of Margate is Dreamland actually. And there's a quote about dreamers and realists, which I will read it actually. There are dreamers and there are realists in this world, and you'd think the dreamers would find the dreamers, and the realists would find the realists. But more often than not, the opposite is true. See? The dreamers need the realists to keep them from soaring too close to the sun. And the realists, well, without the dreamers, they might never get off the ground. And what we have in Margate, actually, is Dreamland, as I said earlier. But basically, the planning department took a very realistic and pragmatic view of how to regenerate this rather faded resort in the centre of this town, which had been established in the 1930s and 40s, very successful in the 50s. And then when everyone started flying off for holidays in the 1960s, it declined. It was set in a major decline. And the planning department used every planning tool in their armoury. It used CPO, it used THI initiatives, it used listing to actually regenerate this place. You know, probably could not be put to too many other uses, and in that sense supported the regeneration of the whole seafront. And for me, this little story indicates that as planners, we're an adaptable and resourceful bunch, and all we need is the right tools to do more. And I make reference to that in respect of land value capture, which is something which I think we should explore more and government should initiate. And so on to my final slide. This is the Peace Bridge, and it's in the city of Derry, or is it Londonderry, or do they call it Legendary? And as planners, we can often talk of the big numbers, 300,000 new homes per annum here or there, 50,000 new jobs, the big strategy, the master plan. But at the heart of planning, communities, people, and places. And each place has its own context. And nowhere else in the UK does context resonate as highly, as strongly as in Northern Ireland, and in particular in this city, which for many is full of totems of repression, aggression, symbols such as the Bogside and Fort George, and a place which during the lives of many of us was really one of despair and sectarianism. And then through the peace process, the Northern Ireland Office, the local authority and stakeholders have worked tirelessly to forge a different place, to heal and reconcile and reinvigorate and turn the symbols of division into ones of hope, basically. And this work could only be led on by members of this profession who understand communities and believe in the power of planning to transform and regenerate, and in time to build a better place and a better world. And for that reason, for many of us actually, it's been such an honour for me to serve as President this year. Thank you very much.